Hey folks, tonight we kick off with some slow-mo weirdness about the death of Henry VIII, the Tudor king whose life was packed with wives, wars, and some seriously questionable axe-related decisions. So, before you get comfy, take a sec to like and subscribe, but only if you actually dig what I'm doing here, and drop a comment telling me where you're watching from and what time it is. Always fun to see who's tagging along from around the globe. Now, dim those lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soothing white noise. Let's dive into tonight's journey together. At the height of his reign, Henry VIII was England's golden boy during the Renaissance. Tall, broad-shouldered, muscular, and by all accounts, a total hottie in tight pants. Fast forward to his later years, and you'd be forgiven for mistaking him for a fancy, angry armchair with a bad attitude by the 1540s. Henry had entered what polite historians call his decline. He packed on over 300 pounds, mostly around the midsection, and was battling a laundry list of health issues like chronic leg ulcers, gout, and the side effects of eating meat that was about to get banned. Chronic leg ulcers, gout, and the side effects of a soon-to-be outlawed meat-heavy diet. His transformation from dashing prince to tragic figure was so epic it deserved its own Greek tragedy with extra sauce. This wasn't just royal pampering gone wild. Henry was in real pain. Lots of it. Every joint ached. His leg ulcers constantly throbbed and smelled like something you wouldn't even serve at a 14th century tavern. He couldn't climb stairs, ride horses, or even walk without shoes. His fancy underwear had basically become a barrier between him and reality. Still, the image of the glorious king had to be preserved. Portraits kept showing a strapping man with broad shoulders and eyes that screamed, "I'm on a divine mission." Not, "I've been glued to this chair so long, my armor's fused to it." His tailor must have had nightmares keeping up. One report claims his final suit of armor required a 54-inch waist measurement, and that's being generous. Beneath the velvet and jewels, the guy was rotting away. Openly, and with a budget to match, courtiers avoided standing too close. Servants prayed they wouldn't get stuck with the dirty work. Doctors tried everything from poking to draining pus, but mostly just ended up making a royal mess. Expensive linens soaked in royal goo near the end. Henry VIII's most famous feature wasn't his beard, codpiece, or wedding record. Nope. It was his legs, or more precisely. What happened to them? What started as small wounds from a jousting accident in his 30s turned into royal horror show. His legs were riddled with chronic ulcers, deep, festering sores that never healed and kept oozing. Imagine running a kingdom while perched on 2 infected meat sacks. That was Henry's daily grind. The ulcers weren't just painful, they were legendary. Visitors commented on the aroma wafting through the room. Ambassadors dreaded court appearances, not for politics, but because they didn't want to breathe near his ankles. Doctors said the ulcers were so deep you could see bone. Ooze was a popular word in letters back then, if Shakespeare wrote body horror. This would be Act 1. Naturally, the 16th century's best medical minds were called in, which basically meant herbs, and hoping God would intervene. Treatments included poultices made from honey, rose oil, and anything else the church approved. They even tried cauterizing the wounds. Yep, burning the sores closed, which Henry definitely didn't like. Then came the stabbing. Oh, the stabbing. A daily ritual of cutting the wounds with knives and cloth. Imagine being the doc showing up every morning like, "Good morning. Your Majesty, Here to stab your leg again. No wonder many royal doctors died young, probably from the trauma. The ulcers also made exercise nearly impossible, combined with Henry's high-calorie diet creating a vicious cycle of decline. The 16th century kicked in, which means they were basically mixing herbs and hoping some divine intervention would show up. Treatments included poultices made from honey, rose oil, and whatever else seemed church-approved. They even tried electric burns. Yep. Burning wounds shut something Henry definitely didn't like. And, honestly, who would then there was stabbing? Oh yes, stabbing. A daily ritual of slicing wounds with knives and cloth. Imagine being the doc who strolls in every morning like, "Good morning, Your Majesty. Here to stab your leg again." There's a reason many court doctors died young, probably from injuries. The ulcers made Henry almost unable to exercise, and his rich diet just fed into a vicious cycle of decline. The heavier he got, the more pressure on the wounds. More pressure meant more pain. More pain meant mood swings. The court doctor died young, probably thanks to some trauma. Henry's ulcers made working out pretty much impossible, combined with his rich diet, which created a vicious cycle of decline. The heavier he got, the more pressure on the wounds. More pressure meant more pain. More pain meant mood swings. And more mood swings meant someone nearby might get fired, exiled, or worse, forced into remarriage. If you ever wondered what happens when someone eats to get holy or escape reality, just look at Henry VIII's daily menu. His meals weren't just excessive, they were basically weapons. Breakfast might be a few eggs, some beef slices, white bread soaked in beer, and maybe a roasted quail. They were practically weaponized. Breakfast might be a few eggs, a slab of beef, white bread soaked in beer, and maybe a roasted quail to kickstart digestion. Fruits and veggies, only if they were decoration or accidentally fell into a roast. The Tudor court saw meat as a symbol of manliness. The more meat on your plate, the more divine your rule. And Henry, lucky guy, took that as a personal challenge. Roast swan, venison, lamb, eel pies, game birds all drowning in gravy. Origin or symbolism be damned. If it ever breathed, he ate it. If not, it was probably used to thicken something tasty. His drink of choice, red wine, gallons of it, daily. Water was for peasants and washing wounds, not kings. By the end, his body might have been 60% Cabernet. Now, let's talk portions. His meals were cooked in bulk, not just for him, but for a royal crew of tasters, servants, musicians, and whatever entourage he fancied that week. But even taking the entourage into account, Henry ate like every meal might be his last. Spoiler alert, it kinda was. This high-fat, low-veg, gout-ridden diet naturally had consequences. Besides his famous ulcers, his gut was a known nightmare. Royal doctors often noted his bloating, discomfort, and obvious pain. You could probably set your pocket watch by his moans echoing through Whitehall after fasting, and Henry stubbornly refused to change. In his later years, he could barely chew thanks to rotten teeth, but he still insisted on massive portions at banquets. Food had to be pre-cut so he wouldn't get tired. Even lifting a turkey leg became an aerobic workout. In every self-indulgent king's life, gravity eventually wins. For Henry VIII, that moment hit in his mid-40s and was about as graceful as a wrecking ball. Disease rolled in with gout, obesity, and worsening ulcers. By then, Henry was so big and immobile, his care required logistical planning. Gone were the glory days of jousting tournaments and powerful strides across the arena. Now, getting him out of bed took multiple servants, pulleys, and a bribe or two. He barely walked. He mostly just got moved around. Royal engineers supposedly designed a mechanical chair part, reinforced wheelchair, part wheeled throne to transport the king around his palaces. His custom armor wasn't for battle, but to support his royal bulk. You could have lost a courtier in one of his sleeves. Horseback riding. Forget it. They had to build a pulley system. Yes, an actual crane just to hoist him into the saddle. And even then, the horse probably reconsidered its career choices. Exercise, once considered noble, became a legend. His only real movement was turning around to yell at someone, and that took effort. Doctors urged gentle activity, like a few steps a day. But Henry preferred political executions over physical exercise. Burns fewer calories. But hey, great for morale. This physical decline wasn't just inconvenient. It was dangerous. Inactivity made everything worse. Circulation, mood, and his already hostile digestive system. And when you're a king, your health is everyone's business. His entire day was scheduled around how far he could roll himself. Even court ceremonies had to be shortened. State functions were planned to keep the king on the throne as long as possible. If the throne room had a treadmill, it was probably just decoration or used for roasting meat. Still, no one dared say the most powerful man in England was basically crushed by his own bad choices. Among all the royal humiliations, yet nobody dared say that England's most powerful man was actually crushed under the weight of his own choices. Among all the royal humiliations, few things were as memorable or as hard to politely ignore as the stench, and late in life. Henry VIII had a fragrance that reportedly arrived before he did. Back then, body odor wasn't exactly rare in Tudor England. Bathing was more theoretical than practical. Perfume was considered health care and the best deodorant standing upwind, but even by 16th century standards. Henry's smell was something else entirely. The main culprit, his infamous leg ulcers. These weren't just minor sores, they were caves. Festering sores leaking infected goo. Wrapped in the main culprit, his infamous leg ulcers. Not just little boo-boos, these were full-on caves of infection. Oozing nastiness wrapped in silk stockings and sheer denial. The royal docs did their best honey poultices, herbal compresses, lots of poking. But there's only so much you can do when the king's threatening to declare independence. The result? A stench so foul it haunted palace hallways. Courtiers skillfully bowed out mid-conversation. Ambassadors supposedly endured meetings with scented cloths pressed to their faces, basically Renaissance tactical gas masks. Then there was Henry's hygiene, or lack thereof, nearly immobile and in constant pain. Regular baths went out the window. Instead, Henry relied on powders, oils, and layers of thick fabric designed to soak up the shame. Basically, he embalmed himself in velvet and linen, hoping no one noticed what was rotting underneath. Spoiler alert, they noticed. Even his clothes paid the price. Reports say his garments were burned after use, never washed. A fitting metaphor for a dignity now considered disposable. Still, no one dared mention it to his face. Just wrinkle your nose the wrong way, and you might find yourself shipped off to the Tower of London, or worse, assigned to change his bandages. And yep, that was an actual job. Historians don't know their names, but we all owe those poor souls a moment of silence. Being king was hard enough. Even harder when you're constantly in agony, leaking from multiple holes, slowly sinking into your own stuff. By the end of his reign, Henry VIII was not just physically broken, but emotionally unstable. 1 minute, he'd be weeping for his late wife Jane Seymour. The next, accusing someone of treason for blinking too big. His court lived in a constant state of psychological tension. Servants learned to read the tilt of his eyebrows like sailors read storm clouds. He's frowning. Could be constipation or war. Of course, Henry wasn't always like this. Once, he was charming, smart, even cheerful. But as the ulcers deepened, so did his mood swings. Old Henry got replaced by someone more unpredictable. A king whose main foreign policy tool was rage, medical historians suspect. Besides all the physical ailments, he also suffered from untreated depression, chronic pain, irritability, and maybe a head injury from a jousting accident in 1536. But in 16th century England, the cure for a bad mood was prayer, leeches, or blaming the French. Unfortunately, being king meant no one could tell him to take a break. Instead, advisors smiled nervously and agreed with whatever he said. Some even praised his divinely inspired rages, which was a polite way of saying, "Please don't chop off our heads." The result? Chaos. Dozens of courtiers exiled, imprisoned, or executed just for falling out of favor during Henry's mood storms. Even his longtime friend and prime minister, Thomas More, wasn't safe, proving Henry's inner circle was more like a revolving door. By January 1547, everyone at court could see the end was near, except Henry himself. He was falling apart in every way, but legally, you couldn't say that. Under Tudor law, predicting the king's death was treason, turning royal doctors into some of history's most anxious and highly skilled actors. Henry was bedridden. Not just bedridden, completely immobile. The cure for bad moods was prayer, leeches, or blaming the French. Unfortunately, being king meant no one could tell him to take a break. Instead, advisors smiled nervously and agreed with whatever nonsense he spouted. Some even praised his divinely inspired rage, which is a fancy way of saying, "Please don't cut our heads off." The result? Chaos. Dozens of courtiers were exiled, imprisoned, or executed just for losing the king's favor during his mood storms. Even his longtime friend and prime minister, Thomas More, wasn't safe, proving Henry's inner circle was basically a revolving door. By January 1547, everyone at court could see the end coming, except Henry VIII himself. He was falling apart on every level. But legally, you couldn't say that. Under Tudor law, predicting the king's death was treason, making royal doctors the most anxious and highly skilled actors in history. Henry was bedridden. Not just a little sick in bed, it was full on. Can't get up. Lay there for weeks bedridden. He hadn't walked for weeks, hadn't ridden a horse in years, and spent his last days ruling England from a mound of embroidered cushions and questionable decisions. His legs were swollen. Breathing was labored. Appetite was fading. Yeah, by Tudor standards. That still meant eating like he didn't realize his will was about to become the most important document in the country, even though it was obvious he was on his last legs. No one dared say the word dead. The courtiers developed a whole glossary of euphemisms. He was resting deeply. The king was in a pensive mood. The king was just digesting his food vigorously. Even his doctors tiptoed around the issue. One doctor reportedly said, "The king will recover if God wills it." Safe, vague, non-committal, and, of course, blessed by divine approval. The kingdom. Even though his condition was obvious, no one dared say the D word. The courtiers developed a whole secret code. He's resting very deeply. The king is in a contemplative mood. The king is just digesting his food vigorously. Even his doctors dodged the issue. One doctor supposedly said, "The king will recover if God wills it." Safe, vague, commitment-free, and naturally blessed by divine authority. Meanwhile, His Majesty drifted in and out of consciousness, probably hallucinating about roast goose and some Protestant negotiations. But even half dead, Henry VIII had paperwork to finish. He signed documents, amended his will, and appointed a regency council for his 9-year-old son, Edward, who would soon inherit a kingdom along with a crushing debt rivaling France's. This wasn't the grand finale of a noble ruler. It was the desperate orders of a very sick man. While the court pretended he was just on his deathbed, everyone around knew the truth. Servants, courtiers, even the palace rats could feel the shift. But they waited, because the King of England couldn't die until the truth was safely out of the way. And at this point, nobody wanted to be the first to say it. January passed, and Henry VIII hovered somewhere between alertness and the delusions of a dying king. His body was failing, but his mind still had policies to decide, people to despise, and a country to pretend he wasn't about to kick the bucket in front of. This denial was thicker than his swollen ankles. Probably. No official confessions, no tearful goodbyes, no final scene worthy of a movie. Instead, he issued decrees, tweaked his will, adjusted the Regency Council, and arranged power in his usual paranoid style just in case anyone got weird ideas after his final death, which definitely wasn't the imminent one. Most notably, he finalized the succession plan. His weak 9-year-old son Edward would be king, just in case anyone got those odd ideas after his final death, and definitely not the soon-to-come one. Yep, he perfected the succession plan. His sickly 9-year-old son, Edward, would take the throne, backed by a carefully picked group of advisors. Keep in mind, these guys were loyal with the kind of backstabbing skills you'd expect from a barrel full of slippery eels. Henry also ordered his tomb to be finished, a grand architectural project he'd been planning for decades. Spoiler alert, it never got completed, despite all his micromanagement and hoarding of power. The only thing that outlasted him was paperwork on religion. He impressively kept everything vague. England stayed Protestant, but not too Protestant. Just Protestant enough to piss off Rome without actually committing to any doctrine. It was like mumbling something, then quickly changing the subject in church, even in his final days. Henry refused to admit death was knocking. When priests asked if he wanted to make peace with God, he dodged them like a juror skipping jury duty. One story says he finally whispered, "It's all gone." But even then, the court wasn't sure if he meant his soul, his kingdom, or just a missing turkey leg. Meanwhile, the palace ran a strict "don't say the king's dying" policy. Anyone caught dropping phrases like last rites or funeral prep got booted fast, not for disrespect, but to keep up the illusion that England's most powerful man wasn't gasping on his own bed, following royal drama tradition. You'd expect Henry VIII to deliver a tearful bedside confession. a Shakespearean monologue about sins, regrets, and the 6 wives he married, executed, or lost track of. Instead, all we got was silence, or worse, boring administrative clarity. Yeah, priests were by his side, but mostly for show. Henry, the man who renamed an entire church just to annul a marriage and chase theology his way, suddenly got really quiet about his spiritual stuff. No dramatic pleas for forgiveness, no humble repentance, no apologies for all those head-chopping family dinners with his daughter Mary. Maybe he figured he had nothing to confess. After all, this was the guy who believed God personally backed every decision he made, even the messy ones. From his point of view, he never morally failed. He was just chronically misunderstood by Christians and his survival-savvy wives. According to one report, Archbishop Thomas Cranmer showed up just in time to ask if the king still believed in Christ. Henry VIII, nearly unconscious, supposedly squeezed his hand, a gesture open to lots of interpretations. Was it a yes, a muscle spasm, or just frustration that the archbishop forgot the wine? That squeeze was his last confession to her. From his point of view, he hadn't failed morally. He'd just been chronically misunderstood by annoying Christians and survival-savvy wives. According to one report, Archbishop Thomas Cranmer arrived just in time to ask if the king still believed in Christ. Henry VIII, nearly unconscious, supposedly squeezed his hand, a gesture open to many interpretations. Was it a yes, a muscle spasm, or just irritation that the archbishop didn't bring wine? That squeeze was probably the last confession he ever gave her. For a control-obsessed man, it's telling that his final hours weren't for reflection, but for paperwork, authorizations, and vague spiritual gestures, while other kings died repentant. Henry died reallocating resources, and though he once called himself the supreme head of the Church of England on earth, now he faced death with just a nod and a twitch of the hand. Apparently, divine authority doesn't cover exit interviews. But hey, that's just Henry. No apologies. No crying monks. Just business as usual. And then Henry VIII just up and left no dramatic goodbye. No poetic last words. And zero indication he thought anything was wrong. When Henry VIII finally stopped breathing on January 28, 1547, the room didn't erupt in wails or grand speeches. Instead, it just froze awkwardly, then stood around uncomfortably and quietly panicked. Because here's the thing, announcing the king's death without explicit permission was illegal. According to Tudor law, even hinting the king was dead, no matter how obvious, was technically treason. So suddenly, everyone in the room got super invested in pretending Henry VIII was just resting. Deeply and permanently resting. Doctors, courtiers, and priests stared each other down, waiting for someone to blink first. Nobody did. No press release, no national mourning, no trumpets, just the heavy silence of a bunch of guys thinking. So, what now? Eventually, they agreed to keep quiet for days, not out of respect, but strategy. Succession still needed managing. The council met, and most importantly, 9-year-old heir Edward was quietly informed that technically, he now owned pretty much everything in England, including some seriously pissed-off neighbors. Meanwhile, Henry VIII's corpse stayed put at Whitehall Palace, still titled King, but now with way more biological demands. Ministers quietly shuffled his affairs while pretending he was still around, not exactly lying, just a spectacular dodge. And while no one dared say the D word, palace staff started prepping everything like it was a Shakespearean farce. Mourning clothes arranged silently, seals changed. Opportunists probably started dusting off family trees to prove they were 12th cousins of the new king and thus deserved land. Even foreign ambassadors weren't told right away. Diplomats from France and the Holy Roman Empire kept negotiating with toothy, smiling courtiers, hoping no one caught the faint royal stink wafting through the velvet curtains. The whole country was being led by a man who was legally alive, just unusually quiet, not moving much, and about to need one hell of a coffin when Henry VIII officially died, if you can call it that. Well, immediately or not. Royal managers faced a fresh, urgent dilemma: what to do with the body, and bad news for everyone involved. The body had opinions too, mostly about decomposing. To be blunt, the man was enormous, over 300 pounds, but not in a fit way, more like a fancy, squishy pudding. His body was riddled with infections, ulcers, and years of overindulgence. So naturally, it started breaking down way faster than expected. In Whitehall's chilly hall, servants and embalmers scrambled to preserve the king. But this wasn't the golden age of refrigeration. Embalming was crude stuffing spices into the corpse and wrapping it in layers of cloth like some royal lasagna. They hoped cinnamon and cloves would mask the rot. Spoiler alert, they didn't, despite their efforts. The body first leaked slowly, then alarmingly fast. A mix of bodily fluids seeped through the coffin, causing discomfort, confusion, and eventually widespread nausea. Things got so bad at the Windsor funeral that the coffin reportedly oozed a black stain and smelled so bad it spooked the horses. And in a delightfully grim twist, it even attracted wild dogs. Yep, dogs licking drips off the former head of the Church of England. Definitely not how Henry imagined his legacy. Nausea spread like wildfire. Things got so bad that at his Windsor funeral, people said the coffin leaked a black stain and an odor strong enough to startle horses. And according to another infamous story, it even attracted wild dogs. Yep, dogs licking the drips from the former head of the Church of England, not exactly the legacy he dreamed of. Worse yet, the coffin was hastily sealed. Royal urgency overrode craftsmanship. It swelled from gases inside and reportedly cracked. Tudor Tupperware was not up to the task. Everyone involved tried to keep a straight face. The nobles walking next to the bleeding coffin wore the solemn looks of people pretending not to smell anything. And no one, absolutely no one, ever mentioned it again in later conversations. Not every day you get a royal corpse making headlines, but let's be honest. Henry VIII was never the quiet type, not in life, and definitely not in death. As the funeral procession made its way to Windsor Castle, the sealed wooden coffin of the late king emitted some seriously disturbing noises. Now, you'd think transporting England's most iconic monarch would call for something fancy, like a marble sarcophagus, or at least something that didn't look like an overcooked meat locker. But no. Biology and bad timing teamed up to make this final trip unforgettable for all the wrong reasons. The coffin started leaking. Not metaphorically, literally. Despite embalming attempts, the mix of heat, gases, a leaky ceiling, and sheer mass made it sweat. And by sweat, I mean gross slime. Contemporary chroniclers described a black, rotting liquid dripping from the bottom of the coffin during a stop at Sion Abbey. Yeah, details you don't forget. Even if you desperately want to, things got worse. There's a popular tale, maybe total BS, that dogs were seen licking the goo, pooling under the coffin. Imagine that: a royal procession in hushed mourning, nobles in black, while a few opportunistic hounds happily taste-tested what everyone agreed was the king. England has plenty of rituals, but dog snacking isn't one of them at a state funeral. Still, no one said a word. The show had to go on. The coffin got discreetly wiped down. Everyone marched on, eyes forward, lips sealed, nostrils flaring. This wasn't just an embarrassing leak. It turned into a legend, a dark little fable passed down for centuries. To some, it was divine punishment for Henry's cruelty. To others, it was a tragic joke about a life lived way too large. Either way, Henry VIII managed what few kings ever do. He completely ruined his own funeral just by showing up. There's something poetically brutal about where Henry ended up. Not in Westminster Abbey with the other great kings. Not in a grand marble mausoleum. Nope. The guy who broke from the Catholic Church, dissolved monasteries, crowned himself head of the Church of England, got buried in a modest crypt beneath St. George's Chapel floor, almost like an afterthought. He was laid next to his true love, Jane Seymour, the only wife who gave him a male heir and died before she could disappoint him. And that was it. No towering monument, no golden tomb, just a floor plaque that didn't even have his name for over a century. It wasn't until the Victorian era that they bothered engraving his name. Until then, Henry VIII rested in anonymity. Just a few feet below, tourists and royal ceremonies. Here lies the man who once roamed Europe with the Pope's letter in one hand and a turkey drumstick in the other. The man who beheaded 2 wives, smashed centuries of religious tradition, and rewrote England's spiritual map, was buried like a fairly successful businessman. The irony is rich but fitting. After all the pomp, power, rituals, and political tantrums, Henry's final destination was almost quietly humble, even accidental. No grand tomb was built while he lived. No elaborate effigy. No towering altar to remember him, just a lead-lined box beneath the chapel floor. A faint memory alongside Jane and, eventually, Charles I, whose own death was anything but gentle. With all his ambitions to dominate history, Henry VIII ended up in a shared grave with minimal decoration and even fewer visitors. A towering altar to honor him. Just a lead-lined box under the chapel floor. A faint memory alongside Jane and eventually Charles I, whose own death was, let's say, not gentle. With all his ambitions to dominate history, Henry VIII ended up in a common grave with few decorations and fewer visitors. Valeria Massalina didn't become the center of attention by accident. She was born there. A member of the mighty Claudian dynasty, she carried royal blood. Her uncle was Emperor Tiberius, and her cousin later became Emperor Nero. In other words, Messalina was born into a family where power plays were more popular than family dinners. And everyone carried a dagger, either in hand or shoved straight into someone's back. She grew up in the decadent, corrupt, and risky world of Roman politics. A place where virtue was praised in public, but laughed at in private. Right from the start, Messalina got the memo on this dangerous game. Loyalty, just another currency. Looks were everything. And landing the right alliance or hookup at the right time. That could mean the difference between exile and climbing the ladder. As a young lady, she married her cousin, Tiberius Claudius Drusus, better known to history as Emperor Claudius. Back then, Claudius was seen as a clumsy, physically disabled political wildcard and a harmless scholar. No one really expected him to become emperor, but power in Rome, it plays by its own weird, unpredictable rules. When Claudius suddenly became emperor amid the chaos after Caligula's assassination, Messalina, barely in her 20s, became Rome's empress, and she wasted no time settling into the role. Almost immediately, she started reshaping her image, not some ceremonial wife, but a formidable power player. Behind that youthful beauty and public charm was a sharp brain scheming to cement her position. Romans expected their empress to be humble and graceful. Messalina's ambition was anything but humble. She refused to be the woman standing quietly behind the man. She wanted to be the puppet master, pulling strings with flattery, sex, alliances, and fear to climb even higher. In a court full of secrets, she was the queen of manipulation. In the empire's gilded palaces, where rumors spread faster than messengers, Valeria Messalina was about to become a legend and a cautionary tale. Rome had seen ambitious women before, but none quite like her. After becoming empress, Valeria Messalina wasn't just about the title. She made sure everyone knew how to use it. She didn't just sit quietly beside Claudius at court. She whispered in his ear, pushed decisions, arranged marriages, forged alliances, and eliminated enemies, all while playing the devoted wife. Her influence wasn't just political. Messalina was also infamous for something else. Ancient sources, mostly written by men sharpening their axes, painted her as Rome's deadliest seductress. Tacitus, Suetonius, and Juvenal loved spinning tales of her sneaking out at night, working undercover in brothels, competing with prostitutes, and returning before dawn. Whether those stories were true or just juicy gossip, one thing's clear: Messalina's reputation was unlike any empress before or after her. Behind every rumor was a strategy. Her lovers weren't always just for fun. Many were powerful men, senators, knights, noble heirs. Messalina used intimacy like politicians use bribes. Sleep with her, and you might get promoted. Cross her, and you could be exiled, or worse. Meanwhile, Claudius either really didn't know or pretended not to. His reign was full of distractions, administrative reforms, political backstabbing, and his own insecurity as a seriously underrated ruler. Some historians say Messalina manipulated Claudius by playing the innocent, caring, devoted wife. Others think he just didn't want to know. After all, facing the truth would shatter the illusion of control he had over his court and marriage. But Rome knew. Whispered gossip in the forum, jokes in the bathhouses, snide remarks from rival nobles. Messalina's antics became legendary. And while her name became synonymous with excess and lust, she held tight to power. That contradiction, both shameful and untouchable, made her all the more dangerous. She blurred the line between charm and politics, turning her body into a weapon and the bedroom into a battlefield. The Roman elite either feared her, loved her, or sometimes both. Turned your own body into a weapon and your bedroom into a battlefield. The Roman elite either feared her, loved her, or sometimes both at once. But like all unchecked power, walls don't last forever. The higher Messalina climbed, the shakier the empire beneath her got. Messalina's reign as empress wasn't just a soap opera of scandals. It was a masterclass in manipulation. She knew Roman politics inside out and played the game with stunning skill. Her targets weren't always lovers. Often, they were threats, rivals, critics, or anyone dumb enough to challenge her spot as the queen behind the throne. And she was ruthless. One of her favorite tricks, fake accusations. With Claudius usually distracted or passive, Messalina just had to whisper a believable lie to bring down anyone. She accused powerful senators of plotting, wives of cheating, and noblewomen of talking back. Many got exiled, executed, or pushed to suicide. Their crime, just being annoying. She didn't act alone. Messalina had allies corrupt freed slaves feeding info, and sick judges who climbed ranks thanks to her favor. They blackmailed the vulnerable and made sure her enemies were crushed before they could even blink. Claudius, the always detached ruler, often signed their death warrants without realizing he was wiping out loyal folks, those who might have warned him about the brewing storm right at his doorstep. But her most infamous manipulative move was deeply personal. When Claudius married Messalina, he was over 50 and she was barely past 20. That age gap created a power dynamic ripe for exploitation. She used her youth, charm, and looks as weapons to keep up the act of a devoted wife. Claudius, famously affectionate with Messalina in public, believed he had a loyal wife. But behind closed doors, Messalina used that trust like a dagger in his back. She also secured her spot by giving Claudius a son, Britannicus. This made her not just empress, but also mom to the royal heir, a powerful shield that even Claudius's boldest advisors wouldn't dare trash talk. Who would insult Rome's future mother? But her web was tightening, and so were the number of her enemies. Even her allies, those fattened on empire spoils, started whispering about her recklessness. A court built on blackmail and fear can only last so long before it turns on itself. Messalina either didn't notice or didn't care that her secret empire was rotting from within, and that the people she crushed on her climb up were waiting in silent, patient ambush in the brutal world of Roman power. No queen sits pretty without being challenged for long. Messalina had plenty of enemies, but one of the deadliest threats to her throne wasn't some scheming senator or bitter noblewoman. It was a freedman named Narcissus. And he wasn't alone. Narcissus, a former slave turned Claudius's trusted secretary, wielded huge backstage influence. He managed the emperor's mail, controlled access to him, and most importantly, had Claudius's trust like few others. For years, Narcissus endured Messalina's antics, maybe even profited from them. But eventually, he started seeing the danger she posed, not just to the emperor's reputation, but to the empire's stability itself. Tensions hit a boiling point as Messalina's ambitions flared. No longer satisfied with playing puppet master behind the scenes, she began plotting something far bolder to replace Claudius entirely. Some sources say Messalina started pulling strings behind the scenes. She started plotting something way bolder, completely replacing Claudius. Some sources claim Messalina even began cheating with the handsome senator Gaius Silius. Not just a lover, but a carefully calculated partner in a quiet little coup. Silius was rich, influential, and wildly famous. And Messalina didn't just want him in her bed. She wanted him on the throne. According to ancient historian Tacitus, Messalina went as far as marrying Silius in a public ceremony while Claudius was still emperor. A move that was either crazy or genius, depending on how confident she was that her plan would actually work. This was the boldest political drama of her life, but also the one that led to her downfall. When Narcissus caught wind of this wedding, he was gobsmacked. He knew Claudius was slow on the uptake, but even he couldn't ignore this level of betrayal. Narcissus faced two choices: report it and risk being ignored, or handle it himself. Guess which option he picked? Yep. The second one, moving fast and in secret. Narcissus set a trap. He gathered proof, warned the Praetorian Guard, and prepared a case so serious even Claudius couldn't brush it off. The court was about to collapse. The queen, who ruled with whispers, lust, and lies made one mistake too big to hide. And now, the very knives she used to stab others were sharpened against her. Her enemies came back for her crown. For years, Claudius was underrated not just by Rome, but by his own wife, seen as weak, bookish, and easy to manipulate. He was the perfect husband for a scheming queen like Messalina. But this kind of betrayal, marrying another man, even Claudius couldn't ignore that. When Narcissus finally broke the bad news to Claudius, his first reaction was disbelief. His beloved wife, the mother of his son, had married someone else in broad daylight. Narcissus didn't just say it. He showed him documents, witnesses, the whole ceremony. The emperor was stunned and then furious. This wasn't palace gossip anymore. This was straight-up treason. Claudius, long seen as too slow to rule, suddenly acted with unusual decisiveness. With Narcissus guiding him, he handed emergency powers to the freedman and told him to clean house. The Praetorian Guard, the elite warriors of Rome, were mobilized not to protect Messalina, but to wipe her out. While Claudius returned to the palace, pale and silent, Narcissus moved fast. Lucilius was caught celebrating, dragged into the street, and executed without trial. His allies, those backing the coup or just knowing too much, were rounded up and brutally purged. As for Messalina, she didn't run. She didn't hide. In a weird, almost tragic twist, until the very last minute, she believed Claudius would forgive her, that her beauty, charm, and role as mother of his heir would save her again. She even fled to Lucullus's garden, begging for a chance to talk, to explain, but Claudius wasn't listening anymore. The man she treated like a puppet finally cut the strings. At first, Claudius hesitated to order her execution. He seemed pained, but Narcissus feared Claudius's hesitation and acted first. He sent a captain with a dagger and a simple message: die with honor or be dragged out in shame. Messalina, scared out of her wits, tried to stall. She grabbed the dagger but couldn't bring herself to use it. In the end, the captain did the deed for her. The queen who ruled Rome with charm and silence died alone in a garden, panicked and powerless. And just like that, the most infamous woman in the empire's history was gone. After Messalina's death, the court fell into a tense, chilly silence. This wasn't just the end of a scandal. It was the erasure of an era. Claudius, cold before the public, ordered her name wiped from official records. Statues were toppled, inscriptions smeared, documents about her deeds quietly destroyed or rewritten. Rome was told to forget its queen. But how do you forget a woman like her? Charm and silence died alone, panicked and powerless in a garden. And just like that, the most infamous woman in empire history was gone. After Messalina's death, the court fell into a cold, awkward silence. It wasn't just the end of a scandal. It was the eraser wiping clean an entire era. Claudius, who played it cool in public, ordered her name wiped from official records. Statues were pulled down, inscriptions defaced, documents about her deeds quietly destroyed or rewritten. Rome was told to forget its queen. But how do you forget a woman like her? The city whispered even louder once she was gone. Stories of her final moments spread fast like wildfire. Some say she sobbed, begging Claudius to save her until her last breath. Others claim she cursed him, defiant to the end. Either way, her memory didn't fade as easily as her portraits did. The political purge kept going. Silius and his supporters were just the beginning. Claudius, now suspicious of everyone, started purging his court with full-on paranoia. Freedmen and officials who had dined with Messalina were fired, jailed, or executed. The Senate, eager to prove loyalty, passed motions condemning her treason, calling it a stain on an otherwise spotless empire. Only one guy was left untouched, Britannicus, Messalina's youngest son and heir apparent. Claudius couldn't exactly punish the kid for mom's screw-ups. Still, Messalina's death left a power vacuum, and every ambitious noblewoman in Rome smelled blood behind closed doors. The power clans started scheming to replace the fallen empress. Claudius, emotionally wrecked and politically adrift, had never been more vulnerable. This wasn't a time for healing. It was a reset, a dangerous, shaky calm. Claudius's trust in anyone was shattered, and he leaned heavily on his freedmen, especially Narcissus, who basically ran the empire on proxy. Meanwhile, Rome began rewriting its favorite bedtime story. Messalina wasn't just the cheating queen anymore. She became a cautionary tale, a walking billboard for female lust and betrayal. Her legend, twisted and pumped up, got bigger in death than it ever was in life. She was erased from the royal narrative, but never from Roman imagination. While her body was buried in the shadows, her ghost haunted the Palatine Hills' darkness, whispered about, mocked, feared forever. After Messalina's execution, Claudius found himself in a tight spot, an emperor without a queen, a dad with a vulnerable heir, and a court full of power-hungry opportunists. The empire needed a new housekeeper, someone to steady the palace and manage the royal circus. But Claudius, still licking his wounds from betrayal, wasn't exactly rushing into remarriage. Enter Agrippina the Younger. She was everything Messalina ever was, and then some. Beautiful, smart, calculating, and dangerous in her own way. But unlike Messalina, Agrippina wasn't reckless. She was surgical. Born into the Julio-Claudian dynasty, daughter of Germanicus, sister of Caligula, and mother to a boy named Lucius Domitius Ahenobarbus, later known as Nero, Agrippina saw her shot. She played the long game. Where Messalina seduced, Agrippina negotiated. She convinced Claudius that marrying her would restore the royal dignity. She promised loyalty, order, and, most importantly, a united dynasty. Claudius, older and more easily manipulated, finally agreed. Their marriage, controversial because of family ties, was legalized by a special Senate decree. She became Rome's next queen. But this wasn't a love story. Agrippina didn't want to share the throne. She wanted to own it. And she quickly started purging any leftover allies of Messalina, making sure the old queen's name was buried with her son Britannicus's claim to the throne. She placed her people in key positions, isolated Claudius from former advisors, and started training her son Nero to be the future emperor. Step by step, she dismantled Messalina's legacy, not just politically, but in memory. And the Romans saw through it, feeling played. Some whispered Agrippina was just Messalina, with better PR. Others feared she was something far more dangerous. While Messalina ruled with passion and impulse, Agrippina ruled with calculation and precision. Where Messalina went overboard, Agrippina never showed her hand until it was too late. The empire traded one queen for another, but whether Rome learned its lesson, that's still up in the air. Claudius survived one scheming wife. He wouldn't survive another. And so, Messalina's ghost didn't vanish. It just changed shape. Reborn in the ambition of a new woman rising from the ashes. After Messalina's death, her son Britannicus became a tragic relic of a forgotten dynasty. Though he was Claudius's biological son and the legitimate heir, his future hung by a thread. He was just a boy when his mother was executed. Suddenly, the palace that once welcoming the birthday boy with a gilded cage. At first, Claudius kept Britannicus close, even giving him trustworthy tutors and guards. The emperor still hoped to secure his legacy through his own bloodline, but that hope was quietly and efficiently smashed by young Agrippina. She had zero interest in letting Messalina's kid sit on the empire's throne. Her son, Nero, was older than Britannicus and way easier to control, especially by her. So she launched a campaign to kick Britannicus off the succession list. She painted him as immature, easily manipulated, and just not cut out to rule. Meanwhile, she tirelessly boosted Nero's status. She got Claudius to adopt him, naming him Nero Claudius, Caesar Drusus Germanicus, and handed him titles screaming, "I'm next in line." By the time Britannicus was a teen, he wasn't Rome's golden boy anymore. He was practically a prisoner in his own home, constantly watched, with supporters exiled or silenced. Even his old tutors got swapped out for Agrippina's people, leaving the young prince to grow up politically isolated and suspicious. Claudius, aging and more easily manipulated, seemed to drift further from his son. He lavished Nero with honors and slowly erased Messalina from memory, as if trying to scrub away the shame of his previous marriage by erasing their child. Britannicus became the symbol of a rightful heir, sidelined by power politics, and he knew it. Ancient sources say he grew bitter, fearful, and paranoid. He probably remembered his mother's downfall and feared the same fate. When Claudius died, mysteriously likely poisoned, probably by Agrippina, Nero was declared emperor without protest. Britannicus, now a teenager, was a threat. A year later, at a party, the boy suddenly collapsed and died. Official cause, epilepsy. Real cause, poison. Almost certainly on Nero's orders. According to most ancient accounts, Messalina's legacy died with her son, and the royal line she fought so hard to protect was snuffed out, not by war, but by a dinner plate. Messalina may have died in disgrace, but her story refused to be buried. In fact, the more the empire tried to forget her, the more immortal she became. Over centuries, she morphed from a flesh and blood queen into a legend, Rome's ultimate symbol of female decadence, lust, and betrayal. But was that reputation earned or just made up? Almost all surviving accounts of Messalina's life come from sketchy sources: Tacitus, Suetonius, and Juvenal, guys who weren't exactly fans of powerful women, especially those who dared to act independently. To them, she wasn't a politician. She was a cautionary tale, a dangerous woman who weaponized sex and tainted the empire's purity. They wrote about her midnight visits to brothels, her public marriage to another man, and her endless affairs. But all these stories sound more like moral panic than solid evidence. Some modern historians have started to ask whether Messalina's bad rep was blown way out of proportion to serve some narrative. After all, powerful women in Rome, especially the unpopular ones, were almost always cast as monsters. Think Cleopatra. Think Agrippina in a patriarchal society. An ambitious woman could be a paragon of virtue or a disguised seductress. Messalina conveniently became the latter. Still, even ignoring exaggerations, the truth remains. She wielded serious influence at the Roman court. She navigated a deadly political landscape, eliminated rivals, secured her son's claim to the throne, and used soft power in a world ruled by men with swords and senatorial clout, whether by manipulation, seduction, or fear. She got results. She wielded massive influence at the Roman court. She navigated a deadly political landscape, eliminated rivals, secured her son's claim to the throne, and used soft power in a world ruled by sword-wielding men and the Senate's iron grip. Whether by manipulation, charm, or fear, she got results. Her downfall wasn't just the end of her story. It reshaped Roman succession, paving the way for Agrippina, and ultimately helping Nero rise to power. Her ambitions echoed far beyond her life in literature, art, and pop culture. Messalina became the archetype, a lustful queen, a deadly woman, a scandal come to life. But behind the legend might have been a woman trapped in a system that punishes power in the hands of villains, especially when those hands are carefully manicured and belong to a woman. Messalina didn't just shake an empire. She forced society to confront its fears about women, control, and the cost of influence. And that, more than any love affair, is her most dangerous legacy. Among America's founding fathers, Alexander Hamilton stands out as a genius, the brain behind the national financial system, co-author of the Federalist Papers, and a man with unlimited ambition. But behind the powdered wig and slick speeches was a guy whose personal life spun so wildly out of control it became the country's first political sex scandal. It all kicked off in 1791. Hamilton was riding high, the first Secretary of the Treasury under President George Washington. By day, he was juggling the nation's debt like a pro. By night, things got a lot darker. One evening, a young woman named Maria Reynolds showed up at his house in Philadelphia, claiming her husband had abandoned her and begging for financial help. Hamilton agreed, and soon after started a year-long affair with her. This wasn't just a personal mess. It became a political problem. Maria's husband, James Reynolds, found out about the affair and saw an opportunity. Instead of confronting Hamilton with rage, he chose to blackmail him. For over a year, Hamilton paid Reynolds to keep quiet, but political secrets are like cracks in a dam. Eventually, everything exploded. By 1797, political foes, mainly Jefferson's Republican Party, caught wind of the scandal. Rumors spread that Hamilton wasn't just cheating. He was also embezzling funds. People implied he used government money to pay the Reynolds couple. That's the kind of accusation that can wreck a career. So Hamilton did the unthinkable. He wrote a 95-page confession, known as the Reynolds pamphlet, laying out every sordid detail with jaw-dropping clarity and no apologies. He admitted to sleeping with Maria, paying her husband, and owning up to moral failings, but insisted he never stole government money. The fallout was brutal. Federalists were shocked. His reputation took a massive hit, and his enemies threw a party. Hamilton was publicly humiliated, politically sidelined, and lost almost all influence among Washington's inner circle. But true to Hamilton's style, he failed spectacularly. He'd rather be remembered as a cheater than a thief. It was a gamble to protect his integrity, but it cost him dignity. In the end, it wasn't a duel or debate that cracked the armor of America's boldest founding father. It wasn't a duel or debate that cracked the armor of America's boldest founding father. It was desire, blackmail, and a very detailed little pamphlet. Thomas Jefferson is often painted as the idealistic brain behind the Declaration of Independence, the philosopher-president championing liberty, democracy, and the pursuit of happiness. But behind Monticello's neoclassical facade lies a truth. Jefferson never publicly admitted a secret family born out of slavery. Sally Hemings was a slave at Jefferson's estate. She was also the half-sister of his late wife, the daughter of a white slave owner and a mixed-race slave woman. This bizarre irony isn't something historians missed, even more complicated. Hemings was only about 14 when Jefferson, then in his 40s, possibly began a relationship with her while on a diplomatic mission in Paris. For decades, this relationship was dismissed as rumor. But oral histories passed down by Hemings' descendants tell a different story, one of intimacy, secrecy, and children. DNA tests done in the late 1990s finally confirmed what many long suspected. Jefferson fathered at least 6 of Hemings' children, 4 of whom survived to adulthood. Jefferson never freed Sally Hemings. However, he quietly freed all her surviving children. They were the only slaves he ever freed in his lifetime. Some of them escaped under suspiciously coordinated circumstances, while others were officially freed by his will. Each of them was freed looking strikingly like their father. Despite the clear evidence, Jefferson's defenders long insisted he was a man of pure morals. But the existence of his secret family shattered that myth. How could the same man who wrote that all men are created equal, a man of pristine morals? But the existence of his secret family blew that myth wide open. How could the same guy who wrote that all men are created equal, at the same time, uphold and exploit a system that denied basic humanity even worse? Jefferson kept detailed records. He noted Hemings' pregnancies in his plantation diaries, and her children's births always lined up with the times he was at Monticello. But what was missing was acknowledgement. He never admitted to the relationship, never named them publicly, and never addressed the obvious contradiction between his political ideals and private life. Sally Hemings herself left no writings. Her voice comes filtered through documents written by men who saw her as property. What we know about her character comes from the endurance of her children, who later built lives as free Americans. In the shadow of Jefferson's Enlightenment ideals, there was a secret family hiding behind closed doors, born in silence and forced to carry both his name and his burden. Benjamin Franklin was a printer, inventor, diplomat, and philosopher. A man with unmatched curiosity and intelligence. But beyond the lightning rod and bifocals, Franklin had a far darker side. A scene full of shady clubs, bawdy writings, and a social life that would make most Puritans faint. Let's start with the Hellfire Club. While there's still debate about how deep Franklin's involvement really was, he spent years in England right at its peak of fame. The Hellfire Club was a secret society known for debauchery, satire, and utter disrespect for religion. Their motto: do whatever the hell you want. Less about devil worship, more about scandalous parties and secret caves where upper-class men gathered to drink, gamble, and chase all kinds of intellectual and physical pleasures. Franklin had plenty of similar hangouts in Paris while serving as U.S. ambassador. He was famous for enjoying French intellectual salons, where politics and flirting often blurred together. French women adored him, and he adored them back. His letters show he was no stranger to romantic affairs, even in his old age. He once admitted older women made better lovers, famously saying, "They don't scream, don't nag, and they're incredibly grateful." Yep, the very man whose face decorates the $100 bill also had a passion for codes and pen names. Franklin regularly published under fake names like Mrs. Silence Doughgood, Polly Baker, and Richard Saunders, creating fictional personas to explore taboo topics like religion, sex, and hypocrisy. His writings mocked authority and exposed moral contradictions, but they also hinted at his deeper interest in libertine philosophy and alternative ways of thinking. Then, there were his personal relationships, despite being married to Deborah Reed. Franklin spent years living apart from her in Europe. His letters show no signs of fidelity or deep passion for other women. Some historians even speculate he might have fathered children abroad. Though nothing's been confirmed, the obvious thing about Franklin is he was driven by desire, both intellectual and, well, other kinds. He wasn't tied down by the rigid moral code of his Puritan ancestors. In fact, he seemed to enjoy bending the rules, especially when it came to sex, power, and ideas. So, while textbooks might show us a wise kite-flying inventor, Franklin was actually way more lively, mysterious, mischievous, and enlightened in the late-night hours. George Washington is usually remembered as a marble statue of a tough, fearless, ultra-serious man. But under the powdered wig and military posture was a very private guy, full of contradictions, insecurities, and bottled-up feelings. Let's start with what most people. Washington never really wanted to lead. Before becoming commander-in-chief of the Continental Army, he doubted his own abilities. He genuinely worried he lacked the experience and skills to fight the British Empire. And even after accepting the role, he refused a salary, instead asking only for expense reimbursements, probably to avoid looking power-hungry. He also struggled with his image. Washington was obsessed with how others saw him. He destroyed most of his personal letters, especially those that could tarnish his legacy. Among them were love letters to Sally Fairfax, the wife of a close friend, long before Martha. Sally seemed to catch Washington's eye early on. His letters hint at a deep emotional connection, filled with romantic longing and repressed passion. Speaking of Martha, their marriage was stable and full of love. But forget the old-school romantic stuff. They rarely wrote mushy letters, and the few letters they did exchange sounded more like formal business memos than love notes. Martha actually destroyed almost all their personal letters after he died, hinting there were feelings or secrets she didn't want history snooping on. Then there's Washington's mood swings. Despite his famously stoic face, his personal aides caught him throwing epic tantrums, especially when battles didn't go his way. Once, he threw his hat down with that cold, calm exterior, but his aides recorded some seriously fiery outbursts when things went sideways in battle. One time, he hurled his hat down and cursed so hard soldiers fell silent out of shock. Not public freakouts, mind you, but enough to show the emotional pressure he was under, while still keeping that calm, controlled facade? Oh. And Washington owned hundreds of slaves, a fact often glossed over in patriotic tales, although he had moral qualms and freed some in his will. He still benefited from forced labor his whole life, privately. He even skirted Pennsylvania's gradual abolition law by rotating enslaved workers out of the state to stop them from gaining freedom legally. The father of the nation had his own private doubts, personal regrets, and moral compromises. His greatness is real, but so are his secrets. And buried in that complexity is the messy, often erased human history of all the founding fathers. John Adams probably had the sharpest wit and the kindest heart. He was smart, argumentative, and sometimes downright unbearable. But behind that stern New England exterior was a guy with secrets he wrote down instead of spilled out loud, and no one got more of those secrets than his wife, Abigail. Their letters offer one of the most intimate looks into early American politics, and a rather modern marriage for its time. While other founders had affairs, vanished for years, or buried their personal lives in silence, John and Abigail kept the letters flying. Over 100 still survive. In those pages, Adams poured out his frustrations, fears, political calculations, and deep feelings. When John was away in Philadelphia or Europe, Abigail was more than emotional support. She was his advisor. He regularly asked her opinion on economic issues, foreign policy, and the behavior of other revolutionaries. In return, she reminded him to remember women, a call for women's rights way ahead of its time. But Adams was also paranoid. He was genuinely unsure about his place in history. He hated that Washington and Franklin got all the glory and worried he'd be forgotten or overshadowed after becoming president. He bitterly watched Jefferson become the nation's darling while he faded into the background. His retirement letters drip with envy, frustration, and a hunger for recognition. Adams was famously cranky. He despised fools, and in his eyes, most government folks qualified. He clashed with Hamilton, distrusted Jefferson, and got alienated from almost every political faction at some point. His single presidential term was marked by controversies, including the Alien and Sedition Acts, which muzzled the press and cracked down on dissent. Still, despite all his flaws, Adams never lost his moral compass. He was the only founding father who firmly refused to own slaves on principle, even if it cost him politically and financially. Aren't quite sure where he fits in history. He was unhappy that Washington and Franklin hogged all the spotlight and feared being forgotten or overshadowed. After becoming president, he bitterly watched Jefferson become the darling of the nation while he faded into the background. His retirement letters drip with jealousy, frustration, and a desperate need for recognition. He was also famously cranky. Adams hated fools, and in his eyes, most government officials were just that. He clashed with Hamilton, distrusted Jefferson, and was alienated from nearly every major political faction at some point. His single term as president was marked by controversy, including the Alien and Sedition Acts, which crushed press freedom and suppressed dissent. Yet, despite all his flaws, Adams never lost his moral compass. He was the only founding father to staunchly refuse slavery on principle, even when it cost him politically and financially. That quiet, steady integrity never made headlines, but it defined him. John Adams wasn't polished. He didn't care. But he was brutally honest in writing, policy, and passion, and in his midnight letters to Abigail. He left a legacy more human than heroic. James Madison, the father of the Constitution, is often remembered as the quiet genius of the American Revolution. But behind his modest stature and soft voice was a man struggling not just with political chaos, but also a weakening body and deep insecurity. Just a bit over 5 feet tall and weighing less than 100 pounds, Madison was frail most of his life. He suffered from chronic illnesses, possibly epilepsy. But he tried to keep that under wraps. Friends and political allies often noticed his ghostly pallor and the times he suddenly vanished from public life to recover. He lived in constant fear of dying from overwork or stress. In fact, Madison was so sure he'd croak early that he never bothered to write memoirs. He didn't think he'd live long enough to do anything important. But guess what? He did. Madison was the brain behind the Constitution and one of the main authors of the Federalist Papers. Yet, he rarely took credit. He preferred working backstage, letting louder personalities like Hamilton and Jefferson soak up the spotlight. He was the quiet puppet master in the back room, building the whole government system while the others yelled on the floor. His marriage to Dolly Madison also reveals a lot about his private life. Dolly was everything James wasn't. Bright, outgoing, charming. Their marriage was a power alliance. She made Madison likable to the public, hosting legendary political gatherings in Washington, D.C., where enemies turned friends, usually over her famous ice cream and pastries. While Madison quietly plotted strategy, Dolly managed their image, turning their family into the capital's social hub. But Madison still had his dark side. He was a complicated slave owner, personally uneasy with the system, but unwilling to free his slaves. He even had secret correspondence discussing the logistics of slavery in the New Republic, where, despite being intellectually cautious, his ideas didn't really challenge the system. Later, Madison struggled with depression and isolation. His political influence faded, and he watched his vision of limited government get twisted by the very forces he helped unleash. Madison might not have Franklin's charm or Washington's greatness, but his genius shaped the architecture of the U.S. Republic. Still, despite all his talents, he lived and died haunted by doubt, illness, and the fear that history might just forget him. He built the stage, others took the bows. Thomas Paine was the fiery pen behind America's Revolution. His little pamphlet, Common Sense, lit a fire pushing colonists toward independence. But unlike other founding fathers, Paine ended up a political exile, forgotten and despised by the very country he helped create. Paine wasn't born into wealth or privilege. He was a working-class Englishman who only came to America at 37 carrying nothing but a letter of introduction from Benjamin Franklin. But by 1776, his work changed everything. Common Sense sold over 100,000 copies, a huge number back then. It was written in bold, simple language anyone could understand. It didn't just call for independence, it demanded it, mocking monarchy and championing the idea that government should serve the people. But Paine's revolutionary zeal didn't stop at America's shore. After the U.S. won independence, he sailed to France and initially supported the French Revolution. There, he wrote about human rights, defending the revolution against tyranny. This made him an enemy of the British crown and a hero among French radicals. But when the revolution turned bloody, Paine was horrified. He opposed the execution of King Louis XVI, which made him a traitor in the eyes of the new French regime. He was imprisoned in Paris and barely escaped the guillotine. Thanks to a twist of fate, some chalk accidentally saved his life. Meanwhile, back in America, Paine's reputation was tanking. His next big work, The Age of Reason, attacked organized religion and questioned the Bible's authority. Though he claimed to believe in God, his book was seen as blasphemous atheism. Old friends turned their backs on him. Washington ignored his letters. The followers of the Federalists labeled him dangerous. When Paine got back to the U.S. in 1802, he was basically persona non grata. The guy who sparked a revolution was now mocked in the press, stripped of voting rights in some states, and shunned by polite society. He died in 1809, broken alone, buried on a tiny New York farm. Only 6 people showed up for the funeral. Paine's ideas helped build a nation, but his stubborn honesty and attacks on religion cost him everything else. He lit the fuse, but got burned in the blaze. While most founding fathers are remembered as stern, dull speech givers, Gouverneur Morris lived like a scandalous 18th century soap opera character. He actually penned the final draft of the U.S. Constitution, including the iconic preamble, "We the People." But his private life was anything but textbook. Morris was charming, flashy, and surprisingly easygoing. He had to get around on crutches after losing a leg in a mysterious carriage accident, although rumors said it had more to do with jumping out a jealous husband's window than any noble injury. Either way, Morris didn't let it slow him down. In fact, his wooden leg became his trademark. Just one more thing that made him stand out in a world full of powdered wigs and stiff etiquette. While working as a diplomat in revolutionary France, Morris got a rep as a ladies' man. He kept cozy with French aristocrats, even as chaos ruled Paris streets. One lover got caught up in a purge similar to Marie Antoinette's fate. Another reportedly helped him dodge a mob attack. But Morris wasn't just a rake. He was a rule breaker. He openly condemned slavery as a vile institution, while most of his contemporaries stayed silent or profited from it. He even refused to sign the Constitution unless it protected federal power over slavery, a last-minute demand that got watered down. Back home, Morris didn't exactly mellow out. He didn't marry until late in life, instead enjoying a parade of mistresses and scandalous affairs that made his colleagues cringe. At 57, he shocked high society by marrying his housekeeper, Anne Carey Randolph, who was at the center of a major scandal involving allegations of abortion and infanticide. The press had a field day, but Morris didn't care. He was used to being the odd man out. Even his death was weird. Legend says he tried to fix a urinary blockage by shoving whalebone into his urethra, which caused fatal internal injuries. Whether true or not, it fits the pattern. Morris lived and died on his own terms, often shocking everyone around him, in a room full of powdered wigs and hypocritical posturing. Gouverneur Morris was an unpredictable figure, one-legged, sharp-tongued, and probably one of the most fascinating people you've never heard of. The founders created a new nation promising freedom, justice, and equality. But their private lives often contradicted the very liberties they preached so passionately. And as the legends of America's greatness grew, so did the glossing over of its contradictions. Slavery was the ugliest hypocrisy of all. Many men declared all people are born equal while owning slaves. benefiting from slavery, or actively defending it. Jefferson, Washington, Madison, Monroe, they were all slave owners. The most fascinating character you've probably never heard of. The founders birthed a new nation with promising ideals: freedom, justice, and equality. But their private lives totally clashed with those very freedoms they loved preaching about. And as the myths about America's greatness grew louder, the contradictions got swept under the rug. Slavery. That was the ultimate hypocrisy. Lots of men claimed everyone was born equal, yet many owned slaves, profited from slavery, or actively defended it. Jefferson, Washington, Madison, Monroe, all slave owners, even while arguing for independence. The enslaved men and women were still toiling away on their plantations, stripped of the rights the Constitution later promised to protect. Some folks, like Franklin and Hamilton, took steps toward abolition, but no one tore down the system that built their world. Women, another blind spot. Abigail Adams famously urged her husband to remember the ladies as the new republic's laws were being drafted. He didn't. Neither did any of them. The Constitution completely excluded women. In private letters. The founders, but legally speaking, women had no rights, no vote, no say. Then there was the double standard on morality, affairs, illegitimate kids, secret societies, and juicy scandals were all over their private lives. Yet, they wrote about virtue, honor, and self-restraint. They condemned tyranny abroad while keeping inequality at home. They feared monarchy, but let dynastic wealth and inherited power thrive in their new republic. Some knew the contradictions. Washington agonized over slavery. In his final years, Madison wrote loads about the dangers of factionalism, ironically. While building the very party system he warned against, others like Jefferson seemed to split their lives completely, penning deep philosophical essays by day and managing enslaved workers by afternoon. But these flaws don't erase their contributions. They just make them human. The founders weren't marble gods in togas. They were smart, ambitious men, full of personal flaws and public contradictions. They built a nation on paradoxes, many of which still haunt America today. Their legacy isn't marble statues, but fiery debates about freedom, power, morality, and who gets to write history. And in their secret lives, they tangled in scandals, contradictions, and compromises. We don't just find the origin of a country, but the blueprint for its ongoing struggles. Napoleon Bonaparte may have ruled empires and led historic battles, but when it came to love, he was embarrassingly vulnerable. Behind the tough exterior of a military genius was a man utterly lacking passion, especially when it came to Josephine Dow, his first wife and biggest obsession. Their relationship started like a whirlwind. Josephine, a widow, 6 years older than him, completely charmed the young general. After a brief courtship, they married in 1796. Soon after, Napoleon marched off to his Italian campaign, leaving his new bride in Paris. From the war front, he wrote letters that didn't sound like a conqueror, but a lovesick, desperate man. In one letter, he confessed, "I wake up overwhelmed by you. Your image and memories of last night's pleasures give no rest to my senses." In another, he begged, "Don't wash. I'm coming home." His letters swung wildly between erotic, possessive, and deeply insecure. Napoleon would win a battle and then immediately scold Josephine for not answering fast enough. He demanded daily letters and saw silence as betrayal. His mood swings were so intense his tone flipped from romantic longing to bitter accusations. Meanwhile, Josephine was way less into it, while Napoleon laid his soul bare. She enjoyed Parisian parties and eventually took a lover. This news crushed Napoleon, and his letters started reflecting his heartbreak. Yet even after discovering her affair, he couldn't let go. His letters got darker, more obsessive. He wrote about torment, sleeplessness, and exhaustion. Josephine, for her part, often replied with vague pleasantries or silence. It was a one-sided, painful love. Years later, after divorcing Josephine in 1810 to marry Austria's Marie-Louise for political reasons, Napoleon still had feelings for Josephine. Even in exile, they say he kept her portrait by his bedside. And on his deathbed at St. Helena, his last words was a one-sided, painful love. Years later, after divorcing Josephine in 1810 to marry Marie-Louise of Austria for political reasons, Napoleon still had feelings for Josephine, even in exile. Rumor has it he kept her portrait close by his bed, and on his deathbed at St. Helena, his last words reportedly mentioned her name: France, the army, the commander-in-chief, Josephine. No matter how powerful he was, Napoleon couldn't control love. His letters aren't just history, they're confessions from a man defeated not by enemies, but by a woman who never really loved him the way he hoped. Frida Kahlo didn't just paint pain. She wrote it. Her love letters to Diego Rivera, the Mexican muralist who was both her great love and her deepest wound, are raw, poetic, and dripping with emotion. While others hid their pain, Frida turned her suffering into art on canvas and on paper. The relationship between Frida and Diego was a roller coaster. He was 20 years older, an older guy with a reputation for cheating. She was a passionate young artist with a busted spine and a heart ready to explode like a volcano. Together, they exploded, bonded by passion, torn apart by betrayal. Her letters reveal a woman with love so fierce, it's almost scary. In one, she writes, "Nothing compares to your hands. Nothing compares to the green gold of your eyes. My body is filled with you day after day." In another, she says, "I love you more than my own skin." Frida never hid her pain. She wrote every line down. She called Diego her ugly toad, a loving insult, a nickname somehow capturing both her affection and frustration. Her letters flip-flop between unconditional love and boiling rage, often in the same paragraph. Even after Diego's affairs, some with Frida's friends, and even her sister, she still wrote to him not with indifference, but with longing. Her words asked for nothing but his presence. "I ask you to use violence in meaninglessness, and you give me your grace, your light, and your warmth." They divorced in 1939, then remarried a year later. Nothing between them was stable, but the bond unbreakable even when apart. Frida wrote as if Diego was oxygen, necessary, insane, and always just out of reach. Her physical agony also bled through. Those letters after a horrific bus accident that left her in lifelong pain. Frida described her body as a battlefield Diego couldn't fix, but somehow helped her endure. She was fragile, yet never weak. Ultimately, Frida Kahlo's letters weren't just about Diego. They spoke of the battle between love and identity, devotion and survival. Through pain, she found her language. Through longing, she found her fire. And in that fire, she burned herself into history. Ludwig van Beethoven, the classical music genius, left behind some of the most heartfelt letters ever written. Though the identity of the woman who inspired them remains one of history's great love mysteries, known simply as the immortal beloved. She exists only in a series of unsent letters found among Beethoven's belongings after he died in 1827. These letters have no sender name, no dates, no addresses, just deep, painful declarations of love that have baffled and fascinated scholars ever since. They start with, "My angel, my all, my very self." Another cries out, though still in bed, "My mind is on you, my immortal beloved. Stay calm. Love me today, yesterday. Tearful longing for you. You, my life, my all. Farewell. Oh, keep loving me. Never misjudge the most faithful heart of the one you love." Beethoven wasn't known for being an emotional open book. His letters to others were usually short, formal, even a bit hostile. But on these pages, something breaks. He's vulnerable, intimate, sometimes completely shattered. What's haunting is the despair weaving through every line. He wrote not out of comfort, but separation. The letters show they were apart, maybe forbidden from seeing each other, trapped in a situation no one controlled. He wrote about obstacles, secrecy, and how they couldn't be together openly. Scholars have debated the identity of this woman for centuries. Top candidates include Antoni Brentano, a married noblewoman, Josephine Brunswick, a widowed countess, and Juliette, a former student. Each had a deep connection to Beethoven at different times, but none confirmed for sure. The mystery remains unsolved. What's certain is Beethoven loved deeply maybe once, maybe many times, but this immortal beloved was an alum. Each had deep ties to Beethoven at different times, but no one could say for sure. The mystery remains unsolved. What's clear is Beethoven loved deeply maybe once, maybe many times, but this immortal lover held a special place in his heart. She was the muse, the ache, the unreachable salvation. And then, silence. Those letters were never sent. Maybe he never dared. Maybe he never could. Maybe she was already gone. For a guy who composed symphonies echoing through time, those voiceless letters, full of longing and silent pain, reveal the quietest notes of his soul. His immortal lover remains unknown, but through his ink, you hear her name in every tragic melody. Oscar Wilde, the witty Victorian writer famous for clever quips and sharp praise, also penned one of the most heartbreaking love letters in literary history. And I mean, seriously heartbreaking. No sugarcoating, no flirting here. It's a 50,000-word letter from a guy utterly wrecked by love. It's called De Profundis, Latin for From the Depths. Wilde wrote it while locked up in Reading Prison, serving 2 years for gross indecency because of his gay relationship with Lord Alfred Douglas, a young noble nicknamed Bosie. Their scandal shook society, pissed off Douglas's powerful dad, and turned Wilde from champagne parties to prison bars. The letter starts sad, but quickly gets way darker: a confession, an indictment, champagne to jail. The letter begins with sorrow, but quickly turns into something sharper: a confession, an accusation, a meditation on love and pain. He writes, "You came to me to learn about the joys of life and art. Maybe I was chosen to teach you something even greater, the meaning of sorrow and its beauty." Wilde calls Douglas vain, selfish, and abandoning, but he never stopped loving him. That's the real torture. Every paragraph in De Profundis swings between bitterness and longing, betrayal and worship. This isn't just a breakup letter. It's a reckoning with Wilde's past life. Wilde also blames himself, calling his indulgence and blindness deadly mistakes. He reflects on how he tried to turn Bosie into a deeper, worthy idol. Instead, he got consumed. He admits their relationship ruined his reputation, bankrupted him, and ate away at his genius. But De Profundis isn't just a diary of pain. It's a philosophical thesis born from suffering. Wilde talks about Christ as the ultimate artist of sorrow, how pain creates empathy, and how prison wiped away every illusion he had built. He writes, "Where there is sorrow, there is holy ground." After release, Wilde sent the letter to Douglas, but their relationship was beyond repair. Wilde died a few years later, broke, and in exile. De Profundis wasn't fully published until both men had passed. It's not a love letter in the usual sense, but maybe the truest, most painful one ever written, not about desire, but about what love gets when it stops giving. Virginia Woolf, the modernist writer famous for stream of consciousness novels and sharp intellect, hid a quiet storm beneath her calm surface. Though married to Leonard Woolf, a steady, supportive partner, she loved another woman, Vida Sackville West, a writer, aristocrat, and free spirit. Their relationship defied easy labels. It was emotional, intellectual, romantic, and sometimes physical. It started in the 1920s and blossomed through letters that remain some of the most beautiful lyrical expressions of same-sex love in literary history. In one of the first letters, Woolf wrote, "I am nothing but a necessity to Virginia. It's unbelievable how essential you have become to me." The roles often reversed. Woolf, usually cautious, became the sufferer, longing, desperate, breaking down. Her letters brimmed with repressed desire, humor, and subtle despair. She found in Vida not just a lover, but a muse, a symbol of freedom and bold femininity she both envied and admired. Woolf's masterpiece, Orlando, was directly inspired by Vida, a time traveler who changes gender, embodying Vida's elusive spirit of love, a subtle despair. She found in Vida not just a lover, but a muse, a symbol of freedom and bold femininity she both envied and admired. Woolf's masterpiece, Orlando, was directly inspired by Vida, a time traveler who could change gender, embodying the elusive spirit of her love. It was both a literary experiment and a disguised love letter. Meanwhile, Vida also loved Virginia. Though her feelings often went unreturned, she had other lovers, other intrigues, and her own complicated marriage. But the letters she sent Woolf showed deep admiration and lasting affection. "I miss you more than I can believe, and I've braced myself to miss you even more. What makes their letters special is how they break conventions. These weren't grand proclamations shouted from rooftops. They were whispers that spreading across pages, intimate, coded, soaked in a longing that went beyond the physical. Even when their romance cooled off, they stayed close, exchanging letters until Woolf took her own life in 1941. One of the last letters she sent to her husband Leonard is often quoted, but it's the letter she wrote to Vida that hold her greatest joy. Her vulnerability pours out through every line of ink. In a world obsessed with defining love by rigid rules, Woolf and Vida wrote their own playbook. Their letters weren't just about love. They were love complicated, beautiful, beyond words, and like the tide for prose like Woolf, always shifting. John Keats, the romantic poet who gave us beauty, is truth. Truth, beauty, lived a short but emotional life. He died at 25, but in his final years, he poured his heart into letters to the woman he loved. Fanny Brawne. Their romance was fierce, poetic, and full of dread. Keats, battling tuberculosis, knew he was living on borrowed time. He fell for Fanny hard and fast, and though they secretly got engaged, he knew he might never live long enough to marry her. Death was stalking every word he wrote to her. In one letter, he said, "I was shocked to learn men die for religion. I used to shudder at that. Now, I don't. I could die for my religion. Love is my religion, and I could die for it. I could die for you." Keats didn't just love Fanny, he worshipped her. His letters overflowed with torment, beauty, jealousy, and devotion. He longed for her presence so deeply it physically hurt. He called her his goddess, his shining star, even in moments of doubt. He clung to her image like a lifeline, but illness made everything more desperate. He feared becoming a burden. He feared she'd stop loving him, and worst of all, he feared dying without ever truly knowing her as a husband should. That fear, that burning sadness, made his letters tender beyond words. In another letter, he wrote, "I almost wish we were butterflies living just 3 summer days. 3 days with you could fill me with more joy than 50 normal years." Fanny kept his letters for the rest of her life, though she rarely spoke of him afterward. When Keats died in Rome in 1821, he was buried under a nameless stone that read, "Here lies one whose name was writ in water." But his name didn't wash away. His poetry lives on. And so do the letters he wrote to Fanny, pages soaked in longing, preserved against all odds. A reminder that even in the shadow of death, love can blaze bright. John Keats didn't live a full life, but he left behind a love that felt eternal. Emily Dickinson, one of America's most mysterious poets, spent most of her adult life as a recluse, rarely leaving her home in Amherst, Massachusetts. But behind her shy exterior and cryptic poems was a deep, passionate, emotional world, revealed through letters as mysterious as her poetry. Her most intense letters were addressed to someone she called Master. 3 of these letters, never sent, never named, reveal a woman wrestling with fierce love and existential longing. She wrote, "Dear Master, please open your life and take me in forever. But I will never be satisfied with never." The identity of Master remains unknown. Some think it was Charles Wadsworth, a married minister she admired. Others say it might be a composite, a symbolic lover, or even a sacred desire in disguise, whatever the truth. These letters are unmistakably intimate, tender, seductive, and painful, with repressed longing. Dickinson also had, whatever the truth. The letters are unmistakably intimate, tender, sensual, and painfully filled with repressed desires. Dickinson also had intense emotional relationships with women, especially Susan Gilbert Dickinson, her sister-in-law and neighbor. Over 300 letters to Susan survive, packed with romantic language, poetic flirtation, and declarations blurring the line between deep friendship and romantic love. She wrote to Susan, "Susie, I'll be home next Saturday, back to you and ready to kiss you. Won't I? I have so much hope in you and feel so eager for you. Feeling like I just can't wait anymore. Feeling like now you must have me." These weren't just love notes. They were emotional outpourings written in slanted, swirling handwriting. Dickinson never married, and her love life was basically invisible her whole life. But her letters reveal someone who could love fiercely, quietly, and poetically. It's no coincidence that her greatest poems echo the tone of her letters, the pain, obsession, and sacred terror of closeness. Her words move like riddles, wrapping love in layers of metaphor and punctuation. Emily Dickinson lived behind locked doors, but loved with wide-open prose. Her letters fragmented, half-formed, often coded guide readers into an emotional world too intense to show openly. In a world wary of women's feelings, Dickinson buried hers in poetry and ink, hoping someday someone would find and understand them. Winston Churchill is mostly remembered for his steely wartime leadership, rousing speeches, and that permanent scowl. But behind that tough exterior was a man utterly devoted to his wife, Clementine Hozier. Their relationship is preserved in a remarkable collection of love letters spanning over 5 decades. From the moment they met in 1904, Winston was smitten. Their courtship lasted just 4 months, and the letters started almost immediately. Even as bombs dropped and empires crumbled, Churchill still found time to write to Clementine. His tone, often fierce and commanding in public, softened into tenderness and cheerfulness in private. In one letter, he writes, "My dear Clem, I hope you'll forgive me for this short letter, but honestly, I'm swamped running the British Empire. I barely have time to keep calm." His humor never faded, even under World War pressures. Throughout their long marriage, Churchill was often away military campaigns, Parliament, leading the country, yet his letters remained steady, and his love seemed never to fade. He called her Cat and signed as Pug, nicknames they shared. Their letters weren't just husband and wife stuff. They were soulmates, confidants, emotional anchors, but they weren't always on the same page. One of Clementine's most famous letters, written in 1940 at the height of the war, gently warned Winston he was getting short-tempered with his staff. She didn't scold him, but helped him stay the leader Britain desperately needed. His reply was full of gratitude and openness. He listened. Their letters balanced flirtation with strategy, tenderness with tension. Churchill once told Clementine meeting her conquered him more completely than any battlefield. Even near the end of his life, he kept writing her love notes short, but always sincere. In a world of war rooms and command centers, Churchill found his true peace in the quiet of a letter to his wife. No flashy politics, just devotion. His legacy might be built on speeches and victories. But those love letters remind us that even the toughest men in history lived their softest truths in private. Few love stories in literary history are as dazzling and brutal as Zelda and F. Scott Fitzgerald's, the golden couple of the jazz age, sparkling through the roaring 20s with martinis in hand, madness in their eyes, and a trail of love letters left behind like confetti from a broken parade. Their romance started in 1918 when Scott was a young Army officer, and Zelda was a wild Southern belle. He wooed her with ambitious, witty, desperate letters. I loved you at first sight, and I'll love you till my last breath. At first, she hesitated, unsure if his literary dreams would ever come true. But when his debut novel, This Side of Paradise, became a hit in 1920, she agreed to marry him. They were rich, young, famous, and totally unprepared. Their letters show a fiery love in one. Zelda writes, "Scott, my love." She just washed her hair and had no clue what to do with it. But she was wildly in love with him. Her notes, bright, poetic, flirty, and usually spiraling into her own delightful chaos. Scott's replies were a mix of admiration and possessiveness. He admired her beauty and spirit, but was terrified of her independence. Whenever Zelda tried to write, dance, or express herself artistically, he'd brush her off, insisting there could only be one writer in the family. Spoiler, it was him. That tension leaked into every letter they sent. Love tangled with control. Years passed, and their glamorous life slowly crumbled into booze, bankruptcy, and bitter resentment. Zelda hit a series of nervous breakdowns and ended up in long-term care at a hospital. But even then, their letters held this weird, painful tenderness. From the asylum, Zelda once wrote, "I've tried so many ways to write to you. You've tried to tell me how much you trust me, but words just don't cut it. They're nothing." Scott died in 1940, convinced he was a failure. Zelda died in a hospital fire 8 years later. But their letters, the wild, burned fragments, survived. They show two people who loved each other, like fireworks, explosive, beautiful, and ultimately tragic. A love too big for the world they lived in, forever trapped in ink and ashes,